Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode of The Cloud is Calling. We are here in the midst of season 2, and I'm excited to be joined by yet another fantastic guest in Eric Kedrosky, the CISO at Sonrai Security. Eric, it is great to have you on the show. I would love to get your thoughts on why organizations seem to treat identity security as more of a fringe pillar. I come across this a lot where you try to bring up identity security with them, and it's like, oh, no, and like they kind of hem and haw a little bit. Why is identity such a fringe security pillar within a cloud security program, and what can we do to kind of make it more of a front and center security
Yeah,
pillar?
yeah, this is a topic I speak a lot about, and over the last 4 years working for Sonrai, I've spoken a lot about. But I'll pull it back to my own learnings. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was working leading an IT and security team, and we made the shift to the cloud. And as we did that, we at the time didn't realize that a lot of the paradigms of securing our environments had also shifted with that cloud. We were used to things like networks and firewalls and this and that, and your Active Directory, your LDAP was your main identity store, and you really dealt with most of the time users and groups, and you had your own, your service accounts in there, but they were just like a glorified user. As we've made this shift to the cloud, that whole idea of the network and the firewall and all of these things have kind of gone to the wayside. And we found that identities have really become like at the core of a cloud security strategy. But a lot of organizations haven't made that shift yet. It's a conceptual shift in the mind, and then it's a shift that you need to do in that. And I think that that's why it's still on the fringe. A lot of organizations find themselves at the tail end of a shift to the cloud. Oh my goodness, we're here. Oh my goodness, a dev team just spun up 50 new environments. And organizations and security organizations are still really trying to learn what the cloud is, but you've had these fundamental shifts. So like anybody else, and I mean, I'm a working CISO as much as any other security professional. You're going to try to bring what you know, and what we know are networks and firewalls and vulnerability management, and identities kind of are over here. And that's why we really find identities on the fringes, because those paradigms have shifted, and a lot of organizations just haven't caught up, and a lot of organizations, to be honest, haven't been given the time to catch up. Oh, it's just the cloud, and you guys are experts in the data center, so why can't you be experts in the cloud? Well, it took a sysadmin, 15 years to become a senior sysadmin or a senior network admin or an architect. You're not just going to become cloud experts overnight, but yet the expectation is that you will, because it's just technology.
Yeah, it'd be nice if somebody could become a cloud expert overnight. Maybe ChatGPT can help them with that.
Yeah.
How to become a cloud expert in 24 hours. No, we'll get to that subject in a minute. I'd love to get your thoughts on AI within security and whatnot. But one other key aspect that I think intertwines itself with identity is data. And
Yeah.
obviously, data has been talked about as basically the most important asset for any organization. And obviously, because it's right there in terms of importance, ensuring that it's protected is of paramount importance.
Yep.
So, why do you feel many of your fellow CISOs, and I'll say fellow CISOs because you are a working CISO, don't focus on ensuring that that data access is secure?
Yeah, I mean, to your point about data being super important, I mean, The Economist put out an article a couple of years ago calling it the most valuable commodity over oil, and
Yeah, right there. Yeah, right there with oil. So,
right there, right? So it's the
yeah.
biggest thing. I really think it's not so much about not making it a priority. I think what we've found ourselves in this world is data sprawl, and I'll talk to the cloud, where I've spent the last part of almost a decade. The data sprawl in the cloud is huge, and again, it comes back to going back to what you know and trying to protect what you know. And I remember, I tell this story a lot, but I remember walking into an organization for the first time as their new CISO, and they were one of the largest partners and one of the largest clouds in all of Canada. And I sat down with the team and I said, okay, like I really want to understand where our data is. And I was coming from a company that had made the move to the cloud, so somewhat familiar. And I said, so can anybody tell me where our data is? And so sure enough, a security architect got up on the whiteboard and drew out the architecture of the whole platform, and it was brilliant and it was awesome and it was cool. And I said, and he's like, that's where the data is. And I was like, no, that's where the data is supposed to be. Where really is the data? And I think that's the point, right? I think a lot of organizations are focusing on where the data is, and it's such a narrow scope, and they think that they have that covered. What they're not looking at is, where is the data actually going? And then, I call it a two-sided coin. We talked about identities. It really is a two-sided coin. Who or what has access to that data, and what can they do with it? And then sort of part B to that answer, and I know it's a bit of a long answer here, I also think that organizations are still trying to work, we're talking about shifting paradigms. They're trying to work from the outside in. How can someone from the outside get access to my data that's buried inside? And I think when you move to the cloud, you have to take an inside out approach. Here's where my sensitive data is. I know it, whether it's where it's supposed to be or not. Here's where it is. Now work on the ways, work outwards to see what can get in. And I think that's where a lot of organizations are getting stuck as well, because trying to go outside in, you're just getting caught in too much noise as you work your way in. So start with the data first, and then figure out what identities can get access to it, and start your program that way.
Yeah. Do you feel kind of a reverse, because essentially what I heard you describe is almost like a reverse defense in depth model, right? So for those of you hopefully are familiar with the defense in depth model, and hopefully you are, if you're not, we can talk about that another time. But right, that starts at the outside and comes in, but identity is kind of that fringe layer, right? And data being that core. So thinking about that in that defense in depth model, does that model still make sense, or do we need to start at that very core layer of data and then build out to the other layers?
I mean, the defense in depth model is always going to apply. It's a fundamental security principle, but you hit the nail on the head. We have to think about it in a different way. And the way I tend to think about it and advise about it in the cloud, your data is at the core of your model. Start working your ways outward, and your first tier needs to be your identity, because that's going to be the one that's going to get you. I think of a well-known breach in the industry a couple of years ago, and we're not going to say, we're not going to beat that dead horse. However, at the end of the day, what happened was it was an identity sitting on a VM that had access to a whole bunch of sensitive data. And when that identity then transferred all of that data out of the environment, that wasn't done at the network level. No fancy firewall, none of the traditional controls we have in place would have caught that happening. It was done at the cloud level. But if you started on the inside and you would have looked at you had the data and you would have said, okay, who or what identities, who, what, people, non-people have access to me, you would have been able to see, if you had the right tooling, holy moly, this EC2 sitting over here has access to me, and it can do all these commands, and there's no boundary control in place to let it sync to an account outside my environment. And then as you worked your way out, you would have said, well, wait a minute, that EC2's got a vulnerability on it. Oh, wait a minute, that EC2 is connected to the internet. And oh, wait a minute, that EC2 connected to the internet has all these ports open. But you would have started at your most important thing. And when you get back to what we talked about, data sprawl in the cloud, that's why you have to do that, because there's too much data everywhere that if you try to focus on the outside in, you're never going to get down in those layers to enough visibility. So start with the key resource and worry about it that way.
Yeah. No, that makes that, thinking about that and kind of laying it out how you think makes a lot of sense. And nowadays, I feel like a lot of people love to see kind of that whole path of a potential threat. Do you feel within kind of the cybersecurity landscape, we're trending more towards graph-based alerting, right? Being able to kind of picture that very attack that you just described, or do kind of the general traditional, incidents alerts still hold weight from kind of this new identity data security paradigm?
So wearing my security hat, the graph-based, because I'm a visual person, I'm a visual learner.
Yeah.
That's, it is for me to be able to map out a path and see all the points in that path where there is or isn't a weakness, there is a risk, there is a vulnerability, whatever you want to call it. That's my own personal style.
Yep.
we at Sonrai also believe that, and our whole platform is based on graphing technology. So I'm slightly biased in the answer on that side, but all kidding
To be
aside, no.
biased.
It, again, the volumes of data, the scope, the scale, the speed at which we're dealing with in the cloud, the old adage, a picture's worth 1,000 words. That's why these types of technologies are coming along. I remember days looking at like firewall logs, and that was good enough back then.
Yeah.
It was the way we did it, right? A
It
long
was,
time.
but it was not an enjoyable experience, right?
And what did we end up doing a lot of times? We would get up on a whiteboard and we would draw out a network path, or we would get up on a whiteboard and we would draw out an attack path. So
Correct.
that's why personally, I really like, outside of the Sunray stuff, I really like the graphing technology.
No, no, I like it too. I'm a visual person, and to your point, I can literally harken back to the days where I've stood up on that whiteboard and drawn out the network architecture and been like, yeah, this is the way somebody can get it.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. I want to touch back on my earlier comment of AI and kind of its role in where we're at from security today and where we think it can go. I'm not going to ask you to comment on good or bad or whatnot, but it's going to have a role to play in my view. And so where do you see the most effective role for this AI wave that we're seeing to play inside of security?
Well, one of the ways that I've been looking at it and playing with it and dabbling it in outside of work and then in work as well to make use of it, it's almost like this huge crowdsourcing sort of opportunity where there is a vast amount of information out there. But where's my data and what is it? The data
Yep.
is so spread out all over this thing we call the internet that, yeah, your search, your Google, your DuckDuckGo, whatever you use, it might find something, but there's more out there that you may not be aware of. And so where it's been really useful to me is when asking questions, when prompting in the right way, like, as a CISO, how can I use AI to be a better, that kind of stuff. But all kidding aside, when you prompt it in the right way, it can go find these sort of edge cases of information that you wouldn't have before. And it comes back to the days when we all used to sit around in a large room and brainstorm for, remember the old school strategy sessions or the old
Oh
school
yeah.
brainstorming sessions where you'd sit around a room and that you'd always have that one person that you never thought or never expected to say something completely mind-blowing out of nowhere would be like, hey, and you're like, whoa, and
What
that just
about
changed.
this?
Exactly. And that's kind of how I see, analogy of how I see AI being used. I think it really gives the power. And then also what I really like about it is as you start prompting deeper, okay, you gave me my first level of answer. Let's get more specific. Why don't we set this and do this? And what happens if this is that way and that's that? When you start prompting down, and then it starts pulling more information. And I found that to be tremendously useful. And I think that any opportunity that security professionals can have, especially red team, blue team type professionals,
Mhm.
um, at their fingertips, and the speed at which the stuff that comes back is great. Now, the stuff that comes back is not always great. I remember I was prompting it for a solution to a problem. I'm like, this is a pretty complex problem, and I know I could probably spend a few days researching it and reading this and reading that and putting it all together. Whatever. I'm like, let's just test this out. And I asked it the question, and I generally knew what the answer was at a high level, and I wanted the specifics. It came back telling me how to actually create the problem at scale in my environment, not solve the problem. So that's one of the cons at this point. Like, you can't just punch it in, and what you get out is you have to trust it. And I think that that's a hurdle that the technology is going to have to overcome. But I think it's a hurdle that people are going to have to overcome. If you're going to use it to be lazy, it'll probably work a little bit for you. But if you're going to truly use it as a tool, I think in time it will be very, very valuable.
Yeah, and I think to your point, right? That's kind of how, at least I'm looking at it for right now. Is look, it's a tool. It's there to help propel you to some other stuff or kind of help right alongside of you. If you're just going to sit back and expect it to do 80, 90, 100% of your work, I don't think it's going to be as beneficial as you think. But remains to be seen, right? It's very early, but I like some of the use cases like that you talked about where You can source it for those fringe use cases, kind of those little bit more unknown things, because more than likely somebody's probably come across it. It's just your traditional search, your traditional methods of querying up that information are just not robust enough,
Yeah.
that I think AI has kind of helped bring that
It's
along.
context too. Like as a this doing such and such, I want to. I mean that's very powerful prompting right there.
Well, yeah, natural language, right? I
Yep.
Speaking of more of my Microsoft background, right? Not that KQL is terrible. I love KQL. I took the effort to learn it, but it's not natural,
Yeah.
right? It's not how most of us converse on a daily basis, and so
Yeah.
being able to prompt something in a more natural tone is just far more efficient and valuable,
Yeah.
from that aspect. So before I let you go, Eric, curious on your thoughts on one last remaining thought. What areas do you feel within cybersecurity are a bit underserved, that companies should be taking a closer look at? Obviously, we've talked about data, we've talked about identity. Are there any other areas you feel that companies aren't taking as close a look at as they should be?
I think one of the areas that requires, and again in the cloud world, a new thought is our ideas around sort of red teaming, pen testing, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Traditionally, we did that once a year, once a quarter. We got our little checkbox and we were fine with
Yep.
it. I think in the cloud, like everything else, continuous. The risks we see in the cloud, identity, data, workload protection, traditional CSPM misconfigurations, whatever. The problems are actually quite complex, and it's easy to break an issue or risk down into the silos, and each one of the silos might be like, nah, it's a medium, we don't have to deal with it. But when put together in context, it's pretty critical. So I think like being more active in continuously red testing and continuously pen testing your environment, not necessarily exploiting the whole chain to get to the point, but running that day in, day out, day in, day out. Because what it does is two things. It does it at the speed and the scale of which your cloud is moving. I mean, take a snapshot of your cloud now and 6 months later, like, my God, it changed like a billion times yesterday, let alone in 6 months. I think the other thing too, it abstracts the complexity for CISOs and security leaders to try to solve these, like get the budget and the programs to solve these problems. Because you're going to get into that meeting and you're going to go, I need funding and a team and this for that. And someone in the room, rightfully so, is going to say, well, I don't really think that's a problem, or prove to me that's a problem. By doing those red testing or simulated red testing continuously and at scale, you can go to them and say, no, here it is. Like, okay, we didn't actually roll over that box, but we did it to 90%. And if we rolled over the box using this exploit, this would have happened. And it lays it out. And as we talked about, in a visual format, in a graphic format, I think something like that will serve security teams in the cloud greatly, not only to help them better secure their environment, understand the risks, but I think from, when I put my leadership and my business hat on as a CISO, to really prove that we're focusing on the risks and they're real. They're not just some sort of chicken little, oh my God, we got to do this type scenario. If that makes sense.
No, that does. That does. Well, it makes sense for me, but I'm sure it makes sense for a lot of other folks. Um, no, I love that. I think that's fantastic, and I think a lot of organizations, if they take kind of that mindset and approach, um, there be probably a lot less public incidents that people get to see on their favorite news website,
Yes.
or some other medium that they love to consume. Um, cool. I appreciate that. And before I let you go, I have one other thought.
Sure.
So back in July, there was a you know incident with Outlook and some other folks. Curious on your thoughts on the keys and what happened, and what do you think companies can do to protect themselves from something like that occurring again?
So is this the one where the access keys were published to the potentially?
Potentially, yes.
Potentially.
Everybody had access to Microsoft's lovely keys for both, applications, Outlook, Exchange, you name it.
I mean, I think this is a really big challenge in the industry right now.
Mhm.
These things get put in code. because it's easy and someone forgets it was temporary. I've been doing this 20 years, and how many times has temporary become permanent for decades? I think that, as the number of sort of fingers in the pie and how we build our environments or applications has grown, we hear of DevOps, and sometimes we lose a bit of the ops with the dev. And I think this tracking of these things is really, really important. And I think when you're talking about fundamental pieces now of your cloud security strategy, when you talk about identities, is tracking these keys and things and making sure you have visibility, not just to where they are, but even before they get there, the risk that they pose. So if this thing accidentally gets put in the wrong place, you already know the risk of it happening, which then should also theoretically help you if you're not working in those silos I was talking about.
Hopefully you have like a playbook or
Yes.
some sort of response that you've kind of mapped out already. Been like,
Yep.
yeah, if this happens, we do
Yep.
X.
And it gives me too, like you talked about things companies should be doing. I had like a toss up there. Another thing that I find is incident response in the cloud is still very, very immature. As a CISO going to find, getting a agreement in place with an organization. So should something happen, you got all the paperwork and legal figured out and you can execute. Again, organizations of that type are still thinking in old ways. We'll just take images of my EC2s. It's like, well, what happened if the thing came up for 5 minutes, ripped a hole in the side of my cloud and disappeared? What are you going to take an image of? Like, it doesn't exist anymore. Yep. And I think that's another one of those, with this topic too, another one of those big areas is really thinking about how we do IR and forensics in the cloud. And newsflash, it's going to be like the rest of the stuff I've said. Those paradigms have shifted as well. And we really need to think about those. So,
no, that's great. Yeah, I completely agree. I think IR, just overall security response, definitely is still an area that I feel like is crawling. We're not quite walking or running to where we should be at this point. So yeah, no, that's awesome. Eric, thank you so much for coming on and being a guest. This was fantastic. I would love to have you back for another chat. I think there's a lot more that we could discuss, and I'm sure our audience would love to hear some more fun tales from out in the field and other interactions that you come across. So
awesome.
Greatly appreciate it. Please stay comfortable up there in Canada and tell your dog I say hi. We had a fantastic visitor. Mine visits me from time to time, so I love chocolate labs. I have one as well. So
there you go.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. Make sure you stick around for more content coming from The Cloud is Calling, and we look forward to seeing you again. All right, folks. Thanks so much, and remember, The Cloud is Calling.